Morning. I'm Don Warner with the Community Immunity Center Volunteers, and I have with me Mr. Bill Palm. And we'll begin by saying, Bill, when did you join the Army?
1966, July of 1966. I completed my bachelor's degree and I had, my experience in ROTC. So I was commissioned in July, well, virtually July, and entered active duty at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, artillery basic course.
And that was a span of?
Okay, the artillery school was 2 months, and that was probably the most miserable time I spent in the Army. Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Oh,
Well,
yeah.
There's nobody here from Fort Sill, so you're okay. You went to active duty right from there? Is that?
That's correct. That's correct. I mean, that was the beginning of my active duty. Through ROTC, that was initially ROTC was compulsory at my school. So my freshman year, there was no debating how I would be, spending my time there. Yes, and then after that, it became optional, and I stayed in. I think largely it was my father's influence because he'd been ROTC back in the 1930s and had served World War II and been called back for Korea. So I had a sense from that of service. Yes.
What you were kind of in for, so to speak?
Yeah, I wish I'd had
rephrase that.
Yeah, no, I wish I'd had some conversations with my dad beforehand, a little bit more about the quality of military life, how it actually works. But you don't really understand until you get there. It's an adjustment. Yes.
It's an adjustment. Going overseas, was there ever an option for you?
Not presented as such. I made decisions along the line that I knew were going to take me a certain direction. Artillery was actually my third choice, but I had high math scores on the standard test. I don't know how I did it, and artillery is math intensive. That's where they tend to recruit artillerymen. So yes, it was largely kind of the opportunities that presented themselves.
Wow. What was life like in the artillery? I mean,
well,
different from other service
well,
lines?
yes, and I'll get into that a little bit more as we talk, but yes, my first assignment actually was in Texas, Fort Hood, with the 2nd Armored Division, and they had, in fact, after training in field artillery and knowing how cannon work, an Honest John battalion. It's a technology that was obsolete by the time I got there in 1966. It was rockets, like the old World War II type rockets. They were maintained because they had the capacity to carry a nuclear, tactical nuke warhead. And so that's the first real experience I had. I was working with those weapons, and after my experience at Fort Hood, which was only a half a year, I never looked at such a technology again. I went from Fort Hood to Panama for 2 weeks. That was the best experience I had in the Army.
You can elaborate a little bit on Panama.
Sure. That was the jungle operations course, and we were in a 4-man team, 2 lieutenants, 2 sergeants, and just 2 weeks without harassment. The idea was to get acclimated to the tropical environment, learn to deal with the heat and humidity and the constant rain and so forth. It was good. We walked. Yes, we walked.
Heat and humidity.
Yeah. No, I left there covered with mosquito bites and little lacerations from the spiked plants and so forth. It was, but it was satisfying. Yeah, and we just kind of hung out and learned to deal with the jungle.
For all that exposure, were you inoculated or vaccinated against certain things, or?
Oh, sure. We had gosh, we had the full range of vaccines, of course. And the irony with the experience in Panama was we left acclimated to tropical environment. It takes about 2 weeks to really get physiologically, physically accustomed to that kind of environment. And then I had 5 weeks of leave back in the States. And then I went to Vietnam and had to get adjusted over again.
Yeah, because you
Yeah.
you arrived in what year in
That's 67.
67?
I can remember because it was just about the time that Sergeant Pepper came out. And so I can kind of bracket my tour in Vietnam with Sergeant Pepper at one end and the White Album at the other end.
Well, we're having a little light humor here, but now we're in.
Yeah.
And I know from my research that 1968 things happened.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
And
Yeah,
you
that's
were-
kind
you-
of, I had two kinds of assignments and two kinds of, very different kinds of experience. Most of my assignment, most of my time during the first half that I was there, this was July of 67, I spent with 155 millimeter firing battery. 155, incidentally, just so you kind of have a sense for what it was like. Fired about 100-pound projectile. It was about, I think, 96 pounds. And so, that was, and 155 is about 6 inches in diameter. When it lands, it makes a very big hole. And each round, each projectile with fuse probably cost somewhere around $100 to $150. We would fire up to about 500 rounds a day. So figure, we expended an awful lot of money.
What was the range of that? How far away could?
About 16 kilometers, say about 10 miles.
10 miles. Wow.
Yeah. No, it was good, reliable. I spent a little. We had with our battalion, we had 3 batteries, each of 6 tubes, 6 cannon of 155 howitzers, and then we also had an 8-inch battery. That was 4 8-inch howitzers. They were good. I spent a few days there. Man, there's just that added weight, 200 pounds. You fire it and it just lands in the same hole continuously. Yeah, and so adjustments weren't all that.
What kind of intelligence were you getting, and from what, to know what you were firing at? I mean, that range.
Okay. No, that's the way the technology works, and it's absolutely the perfect question. What you really work best with is an observer. We usually had aerial observers who could tell you what you're firing on. And you start out your day, with, initially adjusting to the current conditions. So every morning you'd register your battery with a known target, a known location, and, depending on weather, wind, humidity, and so forth, you'd have to make some little adjustments to make sure you're hitting the same spot, the intended spot. And then you start each individual fire mission. When someone would call in for fire support, we'd start it out with a marking round, so that it was clear where it was, where it landed, and then adjust from there to make sure we were hitting the spot that, that's why I was saying, it's kind of math intensive.
Math intensive very much. So you have to, friendly fire is always a possibility then.
Oh gosh, yes. Yeah. Bad things happen. My colleague said, every time you fire that weapon, your bar is firing right along with projectile. And if something goes wrong, that's the end of your career. Okay, we're talking about the prospect for something bad to happen during a fire mission. And actually, we'll talk in a bit about how, my time as a liaison officer, where my primary function was to try to find ways to make sure you didn't have the wrong target, make sure things were working right. But you know, let me back off a little bit and talk about how a firing battery is organized,
Please do.
because that will give you a sense for what I
Please do.
did. An artillery battery has a battery commander who's basically the administrative guy. He's in charge of everything, but he has nothing to do with fire missions. He just, you know, he's the boss from on high. There are 2 lieutenants. One is in charge of the cannon, the howitzers that fire, and the other is parked in the Fire Direction Center, and that was my function. And that's where the fire mission comes in. You get a request for fire from somebody, and in this little operation center, this little Fire Direction Center, you have a crew of about 4 or 5 people who work out the math for how the howitzers are going to be oriented, how they're going to be pointed, what direction, what elevation. Because the more you raise the tube, the further the projectile is going to go. We also had variable amounts of propellant, of powder, the stuff that makes it go. So you can adjust using a different amount of propellant. You can adjust by changing the height of the elevation of the howitzer. And then, of course, you adjust back and forth in terms of the direction. But we're set up to hit any place in a 360-degree circle.
And what was Bill Palm's specific role? We've explained several different ones.
Okay. My role in that context was to receive information about the target, and it was my decision to fire or not fire. That's a legitimate target. Yes, I like it. Yes, we can hit it. And then the first thing out of my mouth would be battery adjust, and or fire mission. And then the guy out with the guns would say battery adjust, and they'd start checking, make sure everybody was set in the right direction. But we would get the data that they would use to set the tubes in the correct direction, and then monitor where is it, where are the projectiles actually hitting? Do we need to adjust around a little bit? Is the target moving? And if you have a moving target, then you adjust your fire. You could also have prearranged fire. For example, if there was an operation that involved landing in a particular area, you'd do a preparatory fire mission before they landed to kind of make sure that everybody anybody who might be objecting to your landing there would have their heads down, because you'd be shooting at them first. And then, then you'd have infantry landing by helicopter in the landing zone that you'd already prepped for them. We had the Tet Offensive in 1968, end of January 1968, and I was there in Dongtam, and I actually was at the battalion headquarters for our artillery battalion, and we were kind of looking over at Mito, which is the city down the river from us. And it was Tet, so you expected some fireworks or something. And it just looked a little bit more dramatic than we'd anticipated. And it took a little while to understand that indeed they were under attack, and that there was an awful lot of stuff going on. And we suddenly started getting fire mission requests for fire, just one on top of another. And we were actually firing into the city. And so, yeah, the Tet Offensive was 2 weeks with virtually no sleep for me. It was consistent, constant work somehow or another, either with the Mito being infiltrated and ultimately occupied briefly. It was continuous operations, enemy operations in the area. I was involved either with fire missions or with supplying ammunition to firing batteries that we had out in the field that needed to be resupplied. It was really, really difficult.
I think
Yeah, challenging.
any civilian right now is thinking, he just said he fired into a city,
Yeah. Yes, there were collateral
collateral.
damage.
And that was a term used
Yeah.
back then too.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I mean, it's something you just have to compartmentalize. You're doing your job, and you know that bad stuff is happening, but that's why you're doing your job.
And you can only fire where your calculations are
Yes.
exact to be and
Yes.
where you're requested. to
Yeah.
fire.
Yeah. But the forces that occupied Mito were primarily, I think, exclusively Viet Cong. They weren't North Vietnamese. And like in many places during the Tet Offensive, they were given instructions for entering the city. They weren't given instructions for evacuating the city. So the Viet Cong who made it in were there. And that was, generally speaking, the end of their life. You know, they went in. One of the goals of the Tet Offensive from the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong perspective was to enable a general rebellion against the United States. It didn't happen that way. And in fact, the Vietnamese Army and the U.S. Army and the Marines up north fought back, yeah. Ultimately, it really was a general defeat for the North Vietnamese militarily. The complications come from perception. And in thinking about this, and I have thought about it over the time quite a bit, the expectation in the United States all along had been, we're going to be there, we're going to get out, we'll be, you know, we're big, we're powerful, we'll just beat them and leave. And clearly at that point it was not like that. It was going to be a long, hard battle. You know, when I first got to Vietnam, I had the sense that it would be a long, extended sort of an occupation. And I wasn't sure how it was going to end or how it was going to work out, but I felt that, you know, we would have, you know, our bases from which to work, and we would be there long term. It was going to be hard, it was going to be a struggle, and ultimately probably a resolution maybe like Korea, which was the original idea with North Vietnam and South Vietnam,
Parallel.
were created to be sort of like a North and South Korea. Well, it wasn't the same for a lot of reasons. And I won't get into the politics on that really.
Well, you can skirt the politics, but from your personal point of view,
The reality was where I worked in Din Tung province with, you know, the provincial capital was in Mito, the Viet Cong were wiped out. Not much left. Not much left. What we started to see after Tet was North Vietnamese started to show up. North Vietnamese Army. And there was a difference. The Viet Cong were, you know, and you see this is sort of as a stereotype, but it was very real. They were peasants. You know, they wore the black pajamas and had the conical hats and so forth. It was just informal. It was a militia, kind of a, you know, rebellious militia. And there was a lot of local control of what happened through the Viet Cong. The North Vietnamese Army was disciplined, well-trained, had a uniform, had a helmet, carried an AK-47, well-armed. It was just a different kind of a presence. Just, they looked different, they act different. You know, they were soldiers. That was militarily, you know, kind of how things shifted. As we progressed after Tet, you know, I got reassigned at that point. It was a position that actually suited me quite well. I was the division artillery liaison with the local provincial government, and I had about 4 or 5 Vietnamese officers who worked with me to, plot each artillery target, and before artillery could fire, you had to run it through the Vietnamese to determine whether or not, from their knowledge of the terrain, that this was a good target and that you weren't going to be shooting the wrong people. So I spent about 5 or 6 months involved with that sort of business. That was illuminating. That was really, that's where I learned a lot. I had access there to daily briefings that, for the provincial advisors. So we had our own intelligence people. That's where I got to see a good bit of information about how things were actually running in the province, how we were doing, what kinds of military enterprises there were, what the enemy situation was like at the time, and yes.
Back home, those of us familiar with Tet Offensive, the key words, and then another one was Ho Chi Minh Trail. How did that?
Okay, well, the Ho Chi.
You can broaden your experience out and even give us a political view of that.
Yeah, the Ho Chi Minh was a network of trails, really, and an awful lot that came down in terms of material supplies actually came by bicycle. There weren't that many parts of the trail that could be used by trucks or, motor vehicles in general. Okay, but, I got to know my Vietnamese counterparts pretty well, and so I got a good sense of where they were in the world, how they viewed things. Had a really interesting conversation with one of them who'd been, just well-educated, very bright guy. English was his fourth language and marvelous usage. The interesting point there was that he and I had this long chat one evening about what this was all about. And he and I both thought back to our academic exposures to Marxism, and that really didn't have much to do with anything that we were seeing. It was a Vietnamese Civil War with a lot of Vietnamese politics that were absolutely obscure to most Americans. What they were fighting and what we were fighting were different.
Bill, I have no more questions, but I would like to hear like a minute or two of your summary experience, good, bad, positive, negatives, with the range of emotions that you brought home or had before you left.
Okay. I think one point that was really clear after Tet, as things evolved, and something I never talked to my Vietnamese counterparts about, but we just had a mutual understanding that at some point the U.S. was going to leave, and at some point South Vietnam was going to collapse. That was just assumed at that point.
It's inevitable.
Yes, and that had an effect on the U.S. Army. It had an effect on the South Vietnamese people. Again, it's not the facts as you might see from, a dispassionate, assessment. It was much more a matter of perception, as how people felt about what was going on.
Bill, I thank you. It's been a marvelous interview. I am totally, I've talked to you, and we never talked about this to any extent, but I thank you, and the CMC and staff thanks you for your time here and for your service in Vietnam and our country.